Our first speaker for today is Professor Peter Raymond. Pete, if I may, is a professor of ecosystem science in the Yale School of the Environment, formerly the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. I don't know which one to prefer personally.
Nice, good.
He did a Bachelor's of Science at Marist College in Environmental Chemistry, and then a PhD at the College of William and Mary in Organic Science. He's a career Yale professor. He started his academic career at Yale as an assistant professor in YSC in 2002. So he's been here longer than most people I know. He's received a whole slew of awards. He's a distinguished professor. He was a Fulbright scholar. He's received a bunch of awards for the outstanding nature and body of his scholarship, including fellowship in Julianus and the High University. And he's going to be talking to us today about enhanced weathering, evidence for CO2 uptake at scale. So you have 30 minutes in total, maybe 20 minutes, 10 minutes for questions, however that divides up. So,
Try to finish with 10 minutes left. Thanks, Carl.
all right, where do you go?
We need to turn the mic on.
What I thought.
Excuse me, we got to turn that mic on. Should be a button right there.
Sort of two-part talk. One is to just sort of discuss what chemical weathering is, some of the science behind it, some of the science I've done over the last couple decades, and then talk about this idea of enhanced weathering, or try to increase the rate of weathering for atmospheric CO2 removal. So I have this funny cartoon. It looks like is there a way to get this thing at the top off? Okay. So I have this goofy cartoon that some of you may have seen before, where it sort of puts together how chemical weathering links the atmospheric CO2 removal, sort of the biological cycle, and then ultimately links land to the oceans. And so the process conceptually is pretty simple, right? Where you have these minerals in soils, either carbonates or silicates, and then you have plants on land. Now it's not advancing. You have plants on land that pump CO2 into soil water. And you know, the basic premise is that when CO2 is in soil water, it is a weak acid, right, called carbonic acid. So you can combine the CO2 and water term, and you have carbonic acid. And so in soil water, the concentration of CO2 is usually 10, 20 times what it is in the atmosphere. So these plants are basically pumping acid into soil water. And when it reacts with these minerals, the key thing from a chemical point of view is the carbon in the CO2 is converted to bicarbonate, right? So this term here, this is an anion, it's not a gas, so it doesn't re-exchange with the atmosphere, and its major fate is it goes out and gets dumped into the ocean. And so, yeah, the key point is you take CO2, you move it through the biology, you get it into soil water, it reacts with these plentiful minerals, and then goes out into the ocean. When you look at the global carbon cycle, this is a small but not negligible flux, right? So we currently model it as removing around 0.2 gigatons of CO2 per year, right? A little bit of the inorganic carbon also comes from the minerals, and it moves out with rivers and gets dumped into the ocean. So it's obviously small compared to the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. It's small compared to net primary production, but it's relevant for sort of closing the carbon budget in the sense that it takes terrestrial carbon, puts it in the ocean, and the loop is closed here by producing carbonates that get deposited on the ocean. One of the key things, though, is 0.2, it's a small amount of the 600, right? So it's not moving a lot of atmospheric CO2, but it's going to a pool of carbon that's very, very large. And this is why people like it from a natural climate solution, because it has a large degree of permanence. Once you put it in the ocean, it's a very long time frame before it comes back to the atmosphere, right? It's geologic time scales. And On the geologic timescale, Bob Berner, right, who was a professor here at Yale for decades, passed away a few years ago. He was one of the pioneers at sort of understanding the importance of chemical weathering with respect to CO2 going back in time millions of years. And so that's what this is here. You're going back in time millions of years, and here is the concentration of CO2 compared to current day atmospheric concentration. So here at 15, concentrations are 15 times higher where they are. And one of the points Bob made was that in the Devonian, when land plants really took off, this process of them pumping CO2 into soil water was the main process that removed the CO2 from the atmosphere and brought us down to a level that is recognizable today. And so on sort of glacial and paleo timescales, this is sort of called the planetary thermostat because it's one of the main processes at these timescales impacting CO2. Of course, I think I've made this point. When you look at the anthropogenic carbon budget, right, it's only a small, this 0.2 is very small compared to the amount of fossil fuel emissions. I wanted to just add in one caveat because this will come back and become important later, and that is CO2 and carbonic acid is not the only acid in soil water that weathers minerals. One of the main other ones is acid produced by the nitrification of fertilizers. So this produces an acid. And the important thing is when this acid weathers a carbonate, if your soils are at a low pH, you degas the carbonate, right? And so it actually becomes a CO2 source if you have weathering by nitric or in acid mine drainage, sulfuric acid. Whereas if this acid interacts with a silicate, you're not degassing CO2, but you're also just not sequestering CO2, so it's more of like a net sum zero gain. The other important thing is if the concentrations of calcium bicarbonate get really high in water, they'll precipitate calcium carbonate, which is, again, a CO2 source. And so whether you're weathering a silicate or a limestone becomes important in your budgeting and is part of sort of what the field is still trying to work out with respect to enhanced weathering. This is from a paper that Noah and I are writing, trying to make the case that, in fact, for liming, this process doesn't really occur that much, and it would be really hard to get to a point where we're precipitating calcium carbonate in rivers. So basically, enhanced weathering is we're going to spread these minerals out and try to juice this process, right? We're going to try to go from 0.2 to some larger number. And we'll talk about how large that number could be. But that's the basic premise, is spreading either limestone or silicates, and a lot of the discussion now is around silicates, right? And this is kind of a paper you see a lot from Bierling et al., where you're trying to put down silicates to get your CO2 consumption. The interesting thing is there are a lot of co-benefits with both limestone and silicates. One of the main ones being usually when you put this down, plants grow faster, and that's true for croplands. It's also true for forests around here, which have been acidified historically. And that's partially because they have a lot of other potential minerals that plants need in them, but also if the pH of soil gets too low, plants start to have trouble. And so basically what you're doing by adding these feedstocks out is you're increasing the pH back to a range for better soil health and higher production of crops and trees. The other really important one is that when you put this anion in ocean, it offsets ocean acidification. And it's the same if you put it in a forest floor up here that's been acidified from sulfate reduction for decades. It is a way to alleviate the negative impacts of the acidification of the environment that's been happening. And as I said, and I'll come back to this, it's a permanent. So this is from a paper where Steve Hamilton and I sort of tried to lay out like all the controls on chemical weathering. It's complicated. I'm not going to get into this in detail. But basically, again, if there's 4 controls on chemical weathering, what we're doing with enhanced weathering is just trying to increase the supply of weatherable minerals. Lay them out in the landscape, So this is never a control on the rate. There are, you know, 3 other major groups of, or ways that you can limit this reaction rate, and this is where some of the really interesting science comes in. If you spread these out, you know, how much acid is going to be produced in soils, you know, what is the temperature for that reaction to occur, and moisture becomes important in soil water. And then you have to strip the water out of soil water and get it into rivers, because if not, the concentrations get so high that the reaction won't proceed at a high rate, right? You're become sort of reaction limited, or transport limited, sorry. But this is what enhanced weathering is let's spread it out, and if you get smart, you start doing it in ways where you're also trying to optimize these other components, which is where some of the interesting science is. And so my first paper in this was a long time ago, and basically what we showed was that for the Mississippi River, the concentration of this anion was going up.
They're having trouble with the audio on the online stream. Can you use your mic?
Yeah? Okay, so the concentration of bicarbonate is going up. It turns out like this measurement of alkalinity or bicarbonate, it's actually very easy to make. Maybe some of you have made it, right? It's just a simple titration. And back even at the turn of the 20th century, you could do this titration by just adding acid to a water sample incrementally while having a dye that changes colors when you hit a certain pH. And so we saw that bicarbonate export in the Mississippi was going up. We also saw in this study that, you know, if you looked at individual watersheds, so these are smaller watersheds in the Mississippi, these are a bunch of forested watersheds, these are a bunch of agricultural watersheds, and what we have here is the discharge in that watershed versus the concentration, right? We call these QC curves in hydrology, that the behavior of agricultural watersheds seem to be very different than the behavior of forested watersheds. Where forested watersheds, the concentration dilutes really quickly. This is a common thing for anions. But in agricultural systems, you still had a dilution, but it was much more linear. And so when you start thinking about export, right, when you have a lot of water moving through the system, that's when a lot of the export occurs, and these systems didn't seem to have as much dilution. So agricultural systems were sort of, we thought they had a role to play in this increase in concentration after this paper. And so what we did next, and this was a YIBS postdoc, right, back in 2004, 2005, he was here, Nenghwan Oh. We did a study to try to basically mass balance what the impact of this liming is that farmers are doing on the landscape to bicarbonate export. And remember, like, farmers are doing this because when they put down a fertilizer, they're acidifying their soil, so every few years they have to go spread lime or their soil pH becomes too low. We couldn't mass balance carbon, and so we had to mass balance calcium, but we thought we did a pretty good job. And this was like one of the first papers trying to quantify the impact of enhanced weathering on, at the watershed scale. And basically, what we found was that maybe about 30% of the bicarbonate coming out of these agricultural watersheds was originated from the lime. So in the Ohio and Mississippi, farmers are increasing the concentration of the largest, the anion with the highest concentration of water. They're basically buffering the pH of a large watershed at scale. And then a couple years later, and I think this was from a YIBS visitor too, a lot of water treatment plants in the US measure alkalinity daily. New Haven does this, right? Because they add lime to the water or some buffering agent before they send it out to the houses, because the pipes under the streets will corrode slower. So you try to do this because it's economically better to just use some lime than to have to dig up your streets and replace your plants. And we found this one water treatment plant in New Orleans. It's an old one. It's been around since the turn of the 20th century that had been measuring alkalinity since the turn of the century. And so this was Gene Turner. He gave a YIBS talk, and he was in my office, and he said he had come across boxes of alkalinity measurements in the Carrollton water treatment plant. These are the boxes of measurements. Like, this is what one day looks like. So this is December 26, 1971, and they measured alkalinity, 6 times that day. Like I said, it's a pretty accurate, simple titration. And so over the past, since we published that first paper, I've published other papers basically demonstrating that the bicarbonate flux keeps going up. It hasn't leveled off since 2002. And in fact, the 5 of the highest flux years in the 100-year record is within the last decade. There's a climate component of this I don't have time to get into, but a lot of it is due to land management. And so I think you could use this as one way to gauge the scale at which enhanced weathering could occur. So in the Mississippi, they're already increasing the concentration of bicarbonate by about 10 teragrams. They're doubling it. And so you might say, arguably, with a lot of effort, we could double the global bicarbonate flux, and you're starting to get into like a gigaton a year of CO2 consumption with a massive effort. There are other estimates now, the potential, right? These are some of the papers that are coming out now. People are trying to define the potential of these climate solutions. This is one led by Xuan Zhang that Noah and I are part of. And basically, what we did as a thought process in this paper is asked, how much minerals could you add, and how high could you get riverine concentrations of bicarbonate and calcium before you started to trigger precipitation? So that might be one way that you bound the flux, right? And so in the US, you're getting up to hundreds to tens of teragrams, or maybe half a gigaton of CO2. There's a couple other estimates, and they're all kind of a similar scale, but they're all, modeling the potential. Here's one by Bierling, where he said if we put silicate rocks out on all the current croplands, and they did this in kind of a clever way where they added it to croplands that, for modeling reasons would be predicted to have the highest response or be able to weather these carbonates, so watersheds that are warmer, have more rainfall and stuff. And so they're coming up with kind of a similar number, right? In the U.S., maybe half a gigaton. Globally getting up to the 5-6 gigatons of carbon removal from the atmosphere per year. Here's another one, another thought paper where they were like, well, what if we applied silicates to basically most of the tropical forests? And depending upon the rate at which you apply, you can also get to very large removals and be drawing down atmospheric CO2 by almost 100 ppm. This is the most recent, where again, this is not focusing on ag. This is saying, what if we applied basalt to what they were calling this paper, for some reason, the hinterlands, which is basically non-croplands again. And this is a one-time application rate. So they're going to add 1 kilogram of silicates per meter squared to most of the non-urban, forested watersheds where people don't live. And just for reference, farmers now, when they lime, they add about half a kilogram per meter squared and do that like every 4 or 5 years. So, at least this number, is a number that's on par with application rates that folks use now in managing ecosystems. The interesting thing about forests that's coming out is that when you apply basalt, a large amount of this uptake is not due to that chemical process I walked you through, so it's not the reaction of CO2 with the silicate. It's trees grow faster. And there's empirical results that this is based on when you add something that has a phosphorus and calcium and sodium to forests. Empirically, they grow faster. So, but here's another one where you're getting up to the 80 gigatons removal for a single dosage of a massive area. So these studies are interesting, right? There are these set of papers that are setting the potential. They're not that satisfying because it's not really feasible to do. But I think part of the point is that this CO2 removal strategy is large compared to well, the ceiling is large compared to a lot of solutions, and worth considering if you're going to get into this game. So I'm wrapping up here. Some of the pros are, like I said, a high potential, definitely on scale with other ones folks are considering. The permanence is one that's really good. Once you, in particular, get that bicarbonate into the ocean, you're not really going to see that CO2 again. To a large degree, particularly on ag, the infrastructure exists, right? They're doing this at scale in agricultural watersheds. This one I think is really interesting, even from like a forest point of view, but definitely from an ocean point of view. It's like we need to come up with a way to offset ocean acidification, and this is one of the only solutions on land that does. And like I said, it can facilitate plant growth. The cons are we don't really, we have a good idea that this is a large potential. There's a lot of work to be done to determine, what the actual rates are in the field, how they vary, and if they're economically feasible. Requires a lot of land, although it's usually compatible with other uses. If you're spreading silicates out, it doesn't limit many other uses, at least that I can think of. One of the big ones is, particularly with the silicates, the ecological impacts of some of the feedstocks are not known at scale. And the biggest concern is they also have trace metals associated with them. And these trace metals, whenever you start putting something around that has something like chromium in it, there's a little bit of a concern. And so, we're spinning up some work here at Yale, and basically what we want to do is add these feedstocks at the watershed scale. Because the nice thing is, when you do it at the watershed scale, you can make that integrative measurement at the stream mouth to see how much additional bicarbonate export you're getting. You're black boxing a lot of the processes, which you can go in and start to disentangle, but there aren't very few studies right now being drummed up at the watershed scale. This is Jim Sayers, for you who know him. This is the watershed the weir at the watershed we're going to start at, right? So it's a watershed that has a very accurate estimate of how much water is leaving. So you can go in and measure bicarbonate and create those QC curves to look for your response. And these are some of the other folks on the team, including Quinn, who's in the audience, Feng Chao, Robbie, and a couple collaborators at the USGS. We have 2 potential forested watersheds that we think we have permission to do this at. And here you spread it by helicopter, which seems insane, but people do this. And the general goal of the project is to get to 10 of these watersheds sort of around the U.S. So I'll take questions. Questions?
Thanks for talking.
Yeah.
Is there a mic? Oh, you can just sit down with the mic and press the button. Sorry. Pete, thanks for the talk. Are there concerns when you're thinking about application by helicopter for dust and how that could affect local communities?
Yeah. So the dust is a big concern in general. When you see pictures of people spreading this on the agricultural field, sometimes you see the tractor, but you always see a big dust cloud that it's kind of in. But it has been done.
Sorry, can you move to the
It has been done. There's precedence of folks doing this to offset acid rain on lakes, on forests. But yeah, it's a concern. It's maybe, some of the test sites we're looking at, there aren't many folks living around there, so we won't have that concern. But at scale, it would be a major concern.
Thanks.
Hi. So I've heard about applying olivine to beaches, like on the coast, making use of wave energy. So I was wondering what sort of the pros and cons are of applying it to agricultural fields versus beaches versus maybe other forests, other areas.
Yeah, beaches are a great idea, right? Because we currently have to replenish beaches all the time. Usually, we're not using olivine, but just bringing in sand. I think it's a really clever idea. I think the reaction rates might be kind of slow, but maybe that's okay. So, the issue with the beach is like you don't have those plants pumping CO2 into the soil environment. So you're kind of probably waiting for it to move offshore, putting down more. And so, yeah, I think it's very interesting, but probably lacking high rates. Where in agricultural systems, these soils have the high rates, and the benefits, or like I said, the crops grow faster. You need to apply less fertilizer, which is a bonus. But olivine in particular has these heavy metals associated with it, and so that's one of the things the community is stalling on and trying to work out. Yeah.
So to kind of piggyback off that question, if sort of our interest is in protecting coral reefs, why don't you just apply weathering minerals on top of, or probably not on top of, but maybe like not crushed, but like ground silicate minerals around coral reefs? Is there any issues with that, or something you can foresee?
So one of the main issues with adding these feedstocks directly to the ocean is, unlike putting them in the soil environment, you're putting minerals on top of minerals, and it's like, okay, like, there'll be some impacts to the biota, but you're not like causing a massive change to the system. The issue with putting this in the ocean right now is, well, for some period of time, they're present in the water column, and they have the capacity to interact with the lower food web. And if they make it to the sediments, in there you'd be introducing a bunch of basalt to an area that doesn't really have an analog, and so could have implications to the benthic ecology also. And so with respect to ocean alkalinization, that is one of the main differences and stumbling blocks, is how is it going to interact with the ecological systems. But it's also a selling point if you can figure out a way to increase the alkalinity around coral reefs. That's a selling point for doing it in some regions. Hey.
Can we switch slides while you answer another question?
Just a question on the ecosystem effect. So I understand that with the agricultural systems, that's clear benefits, but forests, the moment, or in general, non-agricultural areas where the natural regional soils are rather acidic, the plant communities are also, they want acidic soils. And I'm wondering in terms of impact, negative impacts, if there are studies out there. I'm thinking here in the Northeast, but also in the tropics where, yes, very old weathered soils, it's great if the agricultural soils get higher pH, but in the forests, the native communities, they may not be adapted to that, and then there may be negative impacts.
Yeah, so this has been done in forested regions. It has been done the most in areas that have been acidified, and the experiments were generally, we acidified the soils. There's a bunch of negative effects of soil acidification, like mobilizing aluminum, and so it's done there to actually, bring the ecosystem back to where it was. So there are large portions, including the Northeast, where the argument could be, we need to do this to remove CO2, buffer ocean acidify, but also restore these ecosystems. And like I said, there have been some empirical studies, including in places like Hubbard Brook, when they add these silicates, the forests respond by, well, there's a lot of interesting responses we don't understand, but the forests grow better.
if we're still asking questions, I
Yeah,
think we
okay.
are, I've got one. So I've also there's this sort of ocean acidification component of this, and like the way that I learned this as a terrestrial person is that like the exchange of CO2, like dissolution of CO2 in the ocean is pretty quick. And I guess that the ocean acidification co-benefit of this, or I don't know if that's a co-benefit, but it must be tied into essentially time lags between, like you're sort of you're adding these bicarbonates to the surface ocean, and then there's some time lag between that change in the pH of the surface ocean and then the equilibration of the surface ocean with the atmospheric CO2.
Right.
Is that sort of what that ocean acidification co-benefit relies on?
Well, the riverine input, like you're not really thinking about additional CO2 uptake from the atmosphere. So you just think about putting more bicarbonate in there, and that's basically adding a base to the ocean to offset the CO2 the ocean's taken up, which is acidifying it. But when you get to applying alkalinity over the ocean surface, there is an idea that one of the limiting steps of that reaction in the surface is getting CO2 from the atmosphere into the surface ocean to react with the mineral. So if you're thinking about from the ocean point of view, that is one of the questions. How fast can we add these minerals where we, basically don't bring CO2 down to like a super low concentration, which is limited by invasion. If that makes sense.
So the CDR capacity of the riverine bicarbonate inputs is essentially like oceanic CO2 that you're taking care of, or is it, to what extent is that an atmospheric?
No, the CDR capacity of rivers is basically how much of this stuff we could put down over how much land. And because plants are in biology is putting so much CO2 into the soils, it's not really a CO2 limitation per se. But in the ocean, you have to react the minerals with CO2 that's at a very low concentration naturally. And so it can be limited by getting more CO2 into the surface ocean. Yeah. So the rivers are just bringing in a buffering agent. I mean, there is some re-equilibration of the carbonate system, which can impact the carbon budget a little, but it's sort of on the margins.
I think we might be ready to
Yeah.
switch over here. I'm not sure. Pete, thanks so much. That was really interesting. So it's my pleasure to welcome the second speaker of the day, Dr. Yong Zhou. He's a G. Evelyn Hutchinson postdoctoral fellow with YIBS for the last 2 years, but he's actually been at Yale as a postdoc since 2018. He is, in the interest of full disclosure, he's a postdoc in my lab. So I know Yong pretty well. He did his Bachelor of Science at Northeast Normal University in China in ecology. He's an ecologist, like a tried and true ecologist. He did a Master's of Science at the University of the Chinese Academy of Sciences and also in ecology, and a PhD at Texas A&M in ecosystem science and management. And then he came to Yale in 2018. So, and it's a real joy to share that he's going to be starting a position as an assistant professor of ecosystem science in the Department of Wildland Resources at Utah State University in September of this year. He's a highly published and awarded scientist. He's published like more than 25 papers. I can't actually keep count. He was recently shortlisted for the Tansley Prize from the New Phytologist Trust. And I'm excited to hear what he has to say today. He's going to be talking to us about increased tree cover in savannas and its possible contributions to climate change mitigation. So Yong, over to you. I think we're ready.
Yeah, thanks, Carla. Yeah, so I'm super excited to have this opportunity to share some of our recent work. And today I will talk about savanna carbon cycling and how increasing tree cover provide us limited benefits in climate fight. And yeah, I guess and the audience here is familiar with this. Since the Industrial Revolution, human activities such as fossil fuel combustion and also land use change are driving the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, especially since 1950. And for example, from 2010 to 2019, and fossil fuel combustion has released almost 9.4 gigatons of carbon per year to the atmosphere, and then the rest of the 14% of the anthropogenic emission was coming from the land use change. And almost half of these emissions stayed in the atmosphere, and then the rest of them were taken by either ocean or terrestrial ecosystem. So in order to reduce the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, so it's very obvious to us that with both reduce the emission and also increase the uptake. And there are many negative emission techniques or nature-based solutions that have been proposed. For example, techniques like enhanced weathering, which Peter just introduced to us, and also the bioenergy solutions, which our next speaker, Professor Yong, will talk about. But among these techniques, afforestation and reforestation seems to be the most intuitive solution to us, because you plant trees there and then let them grow up, and then they will take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Because of this, there are many tree for carbon campaign programs proposed by world leaders, such as the Tree program from World Wildlife Foundation and also from the United Nations. And also one of the largest NGOs, the Nature Conservancy, also proposed to plant a billion of trees. And so you may wonder, if we are able to plant billions and trillions of trees, how much carbon can be removed from the atmosphere? The recently released YPCCC report gave us some numbers about the global mitigation potential of these nature-based solutions, and of course also include the mitigation potential for afforestation and reforestation. As you guys can see from this figure, there is a very large variation for the mitigation potential of afforestation and reforestation, can range from almost 0 to about 10 gigatons of carbon per year. And also in 2019, there was a paper published in Science which gave us a very optimistic estimate. And this estimate is widely cited to justify the carbon benefit of afforestation and reforestation. They proposed that if we are able to afforest or reforest an extra 0.9 billion hectares of land, it will capture about 205 gigatons of carbon. This number is very promising because it's almost 2/3 of the anthropogenic atmospheric carbon burden since the Industrial Revolution. And indeed, in the paper, the author claims that afforestation and reforestation is one of the most effective carbon drawdown solutions by far we have. Then you may wonder, where can we find this extra 0.9 billion hectare of land on the Earth to plant trees? And this map shows the opportunities for forest restoration. And the greenish color indicates regions that are suitable for planting trees. And the yellowish color indicate regions that right now are croplands, but previously are forest lands, which also suitable for reforestation. But if we compare this map with the map of tropic biomes, you can easily see that most of these regions proposed by the forest restoration map are actually from savannas, especially from the African savannas. As you may know, that savanna ecosystems are codominated by trees and grasses. They are unique ecosystems, but in the global forest restoration map, these treeless ecosystems are mistakenly considered as degraded or deforested ecosystems, and they're storing less carbon compared to forest ecosystem. So these ecosystems are increasingly targeted for carbon sequestration through increasing tree cover or afforestation. And just to put in numbers, so in the global forest restoration potential, almost half of this carbon gain are actually from the proposed to farm the increasing tree cover from tropic savannas and grasslands. Because of this unadvertised carbon gain, so planting tree covers have been to planting tree covers to fight with climate change has attracted a lot of attention from news mediums. For example, The Guardian said that tree planting has the mind-blowing potential to solve climate crisis. And also some news say that planting trees can save us some time for fighting climate change. Despite this optimistic news, there are some articles arguing that these tree planting programs are based on flawed science, and also afforestation savanna ecosystem can destroy their unique ecosystem functioning and services. As scientists, we make our decisions based on solid evidence. So what we would like to ask regarding these tree for carbon programs, and whether these numbers are realistic or whether these programs are desirable. In order to answer these questions, we need to first know the magnitude of carbon gain potential from increasing tree cover in savannas. And once we have a general idea of this magnitude, then we are able to assess whether this carbon potential, proposed carbon potential, is overestimated. Before we dive into these questions, we need to understand another unique features of a savanna ecosystem. This is a time series map showing the burned areas detected by NASA satellite images. As you can see, most of these fires are happening in savanna ecosystems, especially in the African savannas. So indeed, tropical savannas account for almost 70% of the global burned area. And the savanna fires are quite different from forest fires that we used to see in the news mediums. Because savanna fires are fueled by grasses, so they are surface fires, which means they burn very quickly, and also their flames are less likely to reach 5 meters. So as you can see, savanna fires are able to kill these small tree seedlings and saplings, on the images, and also have limited impact on the larger trees that are taller enough to escape the fire impacts. So in savanna ecosystem, if there are a higher fire frequency, it will reduce tree cover because it can limit small trees becoming big ones, and also this will allow light penetrate to the ground and support more grass biomass and grass cover, and which in turn support promote fire frequency and intensity. And actually, this is frequent fire is one of the main reasons that keep savannas as a coexistence of grass and trees. On the other hand, if there are less fires and small trees or small seedlings and saplings have higher probability to grow up to big trees, and which means that there will be increasing tree cover, and it will need to decrease the herbaceous biomass and also biomass grass cover, and will decrease the fire intensity and frequency. And so in savanna system, if there are less frequent fires or fires are suppressed, tree covers can increase dramatically and eventually converting open savannas into canopy-closed dense woodlands. Because of this, we're able to use fire experiment to examine how increasing tree cover affect whole ecosystem carbon storage. And in this study, we used the fire experiment in Kruger National Park, South Africa, which is one of the longest running fire experiment around the world. It was initiated in 1954, and since then has been well managed by Kruger staff. And there are 4 sites across Kruger with different vegetation and rainfall and also soil types. But in this study, we chose the one that located in southern Kruger pre-tourist co-op site, which receives about 720 millimeter rainfall. And the reason we chose this is because there is a significant increase of tree cover with fire suppression. And for each site, there are 4 strains which are replicated. And for each strain, there are 12 fire treatments with fire returning different frequencies and also season. But for this study, we only stick the 3 treatments burned every year in August and burned every 3 years in August, which is pretty close to the landscape average fire return interval. And also the unburned treatment without fire since 1950 for almost 65 years when we started the experiment. And each of these treatment is almost 7 hectares in size, and it's very huge. And as you can see from this image taken from the helicopter, and showing one of the treatment that was on fire during the burning season. And in order to quantify changes in whole ecosystem carbon storage, we need to quantify carbon stored in different carbon pools. For example, in above ground biomass, below ground biomass, as well as in soils. We use different approaches to quantify each of these carbon pool. And for grass biomass, fine root biomass, and also carbon stored in soil, we use some common and standardized method, which I'm not going into detail. And here I will introduce two techniques that we use to estimate carbon stored in woody biomass, which is seems key to this project. We use the NIDA remote sensing to estimate above ground woody biomass and the ground penetrating radar to estimate the coarse woody roots. So NIDA stands for the night detection ranging, which is a remote sensing method using pulsed lasers to measure distance. And in this study, we connect the NIDA data using UAV-based remote sensing platform. And the advantage of using this UAV-based remote sensing platform is that because the flight height is pretty low, and then you can connect a very high resolution data. So the NIDA data generally consists of point clouds. And here is an example showing the difference between the 3 treatments. The top one is unburned, and the middle panel is burned every 3 years, and the bottom one is burned every year. As you can see, there is a quite difference regarding the tree cover or like a tree density. And based on this NIDA data, we are able to compute the tree height and also canopy cover for each of these individual tree and calculate the woody biomass based on these parameters using a numerical equation. And also, I'm not going into detail, but happy to discuss later if you are interested in. And we also use the ground penetrating radar to estimate coarse root biomass. GPR is a geophysical method using radar pulse to image the subsurface. This non-destructive method uses the electromagnetic radiation that goes into the soil and also receive the reflector signals and can detect the objectives or boundaries underneath the soil that have different diametrics. For example, roots have different diametric compared to their surrounding soils. Roots have water content of roughly 30 to 40%, but in soils in very dry condition, when we did our data collection, the water content is roughly around 5%, and each of these coarse roots can be detected as a hyperbolic anomaly. Here is an example of the GPR image, how it looks like. Each of these hyperbolas indicate detected roots. And in order to connect the ground penetrating radar data, we established a 10 meter by 10 meter plot with each treatment and scanned the plot on both X and Y axis at a 20 centimeter interval. So you can see some of this hole, which indicated the presence of trees within the plot. And like any other remote sensing techniques, we used some field measurement to coordinate GPR signals to root biomass and applied this correlation to estimate root biomass within the 10 meter by 10 meter plot. Here is an example showing the coarse root biomass. Warming color indicate higher values and the cold color indicate lower values. So based on this estimate, we are able to examine changes of each of these carbon pools in response to different fire treatment. With less frequent fires from annual to triennial and to unburned, carbon stored in above ground and below ground both increased, but there is especially the above ground biomass stored in the woody biomass, which increased dramatically because with less frequent fires, there is a dramatic increase in tree cover. And as I mentioned in previous slides, that the average, landscape average of fire return intervals in Kruger is about 3 years. So we use the triennial as a baseline to calculate the carbon sequestration rate following fire suppression. So following fire suppression, tree cover increased by almost 8% compared to the triennial. But the corresponding increase in whole ecosystem carbon storage is only 35%. And this is roughly about 23 megagram carbon per hectare, since the 1954, 65 years. And this converted to a rate of 0.35 megagram carbon per year per hectare. So what does this number mean to us? So if we plot carbon sequestration rates on the y-axis and the different types of savannas from arid to humid savannas on the x-axis, so at the very beginning, we asked the first question, what's the magnitude of carbon gain from increasing tree cover? So our study is in South Africa. It's a mesic savanna receiving rainfall about 720 millimeter. We find a rate of 0.335. And there are another 2 studies, one in Brazil, and they found a rate of 1.2. Another one was in USA. They found a rate of 1.8. But we admit that we still need more studies, especially for arid savannas and humid savanna to see what the carbon sequestration rate. But the current studies suggest that the current studies suggest that the carbon sequestration rate from increasing tree cover in savannas is roughly about 0.35 to 1.8. And so we come to our second question, is the carbon sink potential overestimated? As I mentioned, the widely cited paper to justify the carbon benefit of afforestation and reforestation, they give us a very optimistic estimate that for the tropical savannas, afforestation can sequester almost 208 megagram carbon per hectare by 2050. It converts to a rate of 9.4 megagram carbon per year per hectare. So which means this proposed carbon gap potential is almost 5 to 30 times higher than our empirical estimate. I mean, this number is kind of concerning because this unrealistic carbon gap potential can provide us a false promise for climate mitigation. And also what makes sense even concerning is that most of these tree for carbon programs do not consider the consequences of increasing tree covers in savanna ecosystem. For example, the influence of increasing tree cover on biodiversity. Here is a map showing the biodiversity across tropic biomes. There's no doubt that tropic forests host more biodiversity compared to tropical savannas, even they have the same size in land area. But the savannas do host hundreds of species with their 75% or even 90% of their distribution ranges within savannas. These endemic species are very important to maintain savanna ecosystem functioning and services. For example, some of these iconic savanna species, like elephant, lions, and ostrich, they require open savannas to survive, and we can't afford to lose them from increasing tree cover. This is because there are some studies showing that increasing tree cover can actually decrease the biodiversity. For example, this study in Brazil studied how increasing tree cover affect ant species. There is a negative correlation between increasing tree cover and the number of ant species. So the key message here, I will end up with this slide. The key message here is that trees should be planted at the right place. Not everywhere is suitable for planting trees. And the recently released IPCC report has a very nice framework that guides us for the tree forest restoration. The first question we need to ask us is, was there a forest before? Because forest restoration is particularly problematic in native non-forest ecosystems such as grasses and savannas. It's very important to remember that just because a tree can grow somewhere, it does not mean it should be there. And these ecosystems, such as savanna grasslands, they are unique and they are important in their own way. That store carbon in soils and also support rich biodiversity. And then the second question we should ask is whether the restoration is possible. Because you need to consider whether the forest can regenerate naturally, or whether this land should be used for agriculture purpose instead of restoring forest. And the next question is that we need to ask ourselves is that will the benefit outweigh the cost? As you know that everything comes with cost, so as planting trees, and who will pay this cost? If all this are taken into consideration, if we decide we should planting trees to restoring ecosystem and to sequester carbon for climate mitigation, so we should plant native trees that are adapted to the environment. Yeah, that is what I have, and I would like to thank my advisor and also collaborators on this project, and also thanks YIBS for the fellowship. I would like to have answer some questions.
Okay, I think we probably have to switch over, but if somebody has a question while we do that, you could
Sure.
maybe go to the middle and Pete's volunteering.
Yeah, so great. Could you use the mic? Great talk, Yong. So if you were to use fire as your way to get forests to grow as a solution, how do some of the other climate forces work out? So I know fires produce methane and black carbon. So have you done some thought to extend it to like a complete radiative budget, or do you have any idea, like the sign of those or how they might change?
And other forces that can increase tree cover in savanna also include overgrazing, and also the increase of atmosphere carbon dioxide, because the increase carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can benefit the growth of C3 trees, and this force can also increase in tree cover. Yeah.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Thanks very much. Catch Yong at lunch if you have more questions.
Thank you.
Good job, yeah.
Okay. Okay, our last talk of the morning is going to be from Professor Yuan, who's an assistant professor of industrial ecology and sustainable systems in the Yale School of the Environment. She joined us at Yale in 2020, so I think she's been here, she's only seen Yale during a pandemic, so I'm excited for you to see Yale post-pandemic. She did a Bachelor of Science at Northeastern University in China in metallurgical engineering, and then a PhD at Northwestern University in Chicago in chemical engineering. She has early career awards from the International Society for Industrial Ecology and the American Institute for Chemical Engineers, so she's prestigious already at an early career stage. And she's going to be talking to us today about bioeconomy and climate change. So, Professor Yao, over to you.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone. I know my presentation is in the block between you and the lunch, so I will make my presentation as interesting as possible to compete with very attractive lunches. So today I'll talk about the bioeconomy and climate change. So first, what is bioeconomy? Well, it is an emerging concept that's really encouraged the use of biomass to produce a variety of different products. It could be biofuels, different chemicals, or even polymers and plastics. Many of those products are currently made from fossil fuel, which is one of the largest contributors to the global greenhouse gas emissions. So this is the figure I got from the recently published IPCC AR6 report, and this figure can show you the global net anthropogenic GHG emissions from 1990 to 2019. And the dominant one is this blue color, which is CO2 from fossil fuel and industry. So one strong motivation of developing bioeconomy is to use biomass to replace fossil fuel, so we hope we can reduce those CO2 emissions coming from fossil fuel. So talking about the biomass, you may be wondering, what are those biomass resources available and we can use? I put some examples here, like trees from the forest sectors, agricultural crops or residues, or even sewage and municipal solid waste generated by us, human beings, or those waste generated by animals or different industrial sectors. We really have abundant and diverse biomass resources you can see in the environment or in our society. And the people have been trying hard to developing all kinds of technologies that can convert those biomass resources into valuable product. So I put 4 major example categories here to just show you some products you can find in your daily life. Like wood product, like furnitures or wood you can find in houses and buildings, different pulp and paper product, biofuels or bioenergy power plant, and a different bio-based product. Here's a photo I put for a textile product that can make clothes or curtain and made from biomass. So our purpose of using those biomass is to replace fossil fuel and reduce associated carbon emissions. However, using biomass does not mean that it is 100% carbon emission free if we look at the entire life cycle. No matter what type of biomass you use, if we look at their life cycle, they always start from the biomass cultivation. Like we may do some farming on different agricultural land, we may do some plantation for the trees. Biomass growth does sequestrate carbon, as our previous speakers mentioned. However, we also generate carbon emissions when we do harvesting, or when we do some biomass production activities, like chopping the biomass into different sizes so they can be easily shipped to different manufacturing plants. Or sometimes we even do biomass conversion. Like most biofuels, they are chemically converted from biomass in biorefineries. And all this manufacturing and industry activities generate carbon emissions through their usage of energy or additional materials, like chemicals, required to make those bio-based products. And once those products are made, they are shipped to consumers. And all the transportation and the logistic activities generate carbon emissions because most of vehicles used in our current society still rely on fossil fuel. And once those products are in use for some years, for some time, when they reach their end of life, depending on how we deal with them, they may generate carbon emissions in different forms and in different quantity. For example, if we have some product, we just dump them into the landfill, they may go through a decay process and generate landfill gas, where the most composition is methane, CH4. But if we decide to burn some bio-based product and recover energy, then likely we will get a lot of CO2 emissions, and all the carbon in those bioproducts are released immediately. So throughout this entire life cycle, there are some activities that generate greenhouse gas emissions, while on the other side, there are some activities that have carbon uptake. So it is very important for us to understand. I also need to remember, use this one, not the pointer. It is important for us to understand what are the life cycle carbon footprints of diverse biomass utilization pathways. Without a very good understanding or even answer to this question, we cannot even be sure that a very specific biomass utilization pathways will lead to lower carbon emissions or net carbon removal from the atmosphere compared to their fossil fuel counterpart. So in order to answer this question, one commonly used method is called a life cycle assessment, which is an industry ecology tool and a standardized method to evaluate the environmental impact across the life cycle of a product. From the resource extraction to the manufacturing, cover all the transportation and the distribution, to the use phase and the final end of life. I'm sure some of you may also heard about another tool called carbon footprint accounting, right? So actually most international standards or guidelines developed for product level carbon footprint accounting are developed based on LCA principles. So many guidelines and standards, they are consistent with each other with the LCA methodology, and these two tools share a lot of similarity. And in fact, climate change is one commonly assessed impact category in LCA. So in the rest of my presentation, I will show you several brief but interesting case studies to show you how we can combine LCA with some ecosystem modeling to better understand the net carbon implications of different biomass utilization pathways. The first one is cross-laminated timber, CLT, which is an emerging wood product that can be used in buildings, and they can replace traditional material like steel. They are much lighter than that. And here I put a cartoon to show you what CLT looks like. They basically are wood planks that are glued together, and they have different layers. But each layer has a 90-degree different orientation with the previous one. So by having those layers glued together on both directions, it can offer very good mechanical property, and they can use it in buildings. So looking at those CLT life cycle, they have a very similar life cycle activity as so many other wood products. Like they all start from forest growth. Like we do some site preparation, we let tree growing, and once those trees grow to a certain age, we do harvesting, and we do logging, and we send those logs to lumber production, which will do sawing and drying to remove the moisture, and the dried lumber will be sent to CLT manufacturer that turn them into CLT product that will be shipped to the construction site that are used in buildings, and once those buildings reach the end of their lifetime, the building will get demolished. So some CLT product may be sent to the landfill, or we can try to do some recycling. So all the activities I mentioned throughout this entire life cycle, most of them require some energy input, like fuels, electricity, natural gas, or they may require some other materials, like glue. And there are embodied carbon emissions generated during the upstream production of those fuels and of those materials. And some of these manufacturing activities may also generate direct carbon emissions. For example, in the lumber mills, some lumber mill may want to use natural gas to provide heat to dry the lumber, and this combustion process of natural gas generates direct carbon emissions. So if we want to use LCA to do a very good analysis to understand all the carbon flows generated in this entire life cycle, it could be very challenging because the traditional LCA is a static modeling method, which means it does not do a very good job for those environmental flows that are changing with the time. But there are several parts in those wood product life cycle that are highly dynamic. The first one is the forest growth. We all know that how fast and how long these trees are growing really determine how much carbon they can sequestrate. The second one is there are a lot of wood waste generated in the lumber production, so like sawdust or wood chips. So if the lumber mill decide to just burn those wood waste to recover energy so they can reduce their purchase for natural gas, it is good, but they also immediately release the carbon in those wood waste. Another option is they just dump them to the landfill. Well, this wood waste will still generate emission there, but because decomposition is very slow, so it will be emission emitted year by year, but in a much slower pace. Similarly, at the end of life of the COT product, if we just send them to the landfill, they will go through a very slow decay process, generate some emission in the landfill. But if we do the recycling, we can lock in those carbon in the product for a bit longer time. So in order to understand those dynamic carbon flows associated with these activities, we first collaborated with forest ecologists who can run those dynamic forest growth model to help us how trees are growing year by year. And at the end of the rotation cycle, which is 25 years in our case, we can estimate how much logs and how much residues are generated per hectare of land and also their carbon content. So we can estimate the carbon uptake by forest growth. We also collected a lot of forest decay data for those large wood debris and the fine wood debris. So those are the forest residue generated when we do the harvesting. Currently, those forest residues are waste, so they don't have any economically valuable uses. So landowners just abandon them on land, and then those residues will go through a natural decomposition process and generate carbon emissions. So by understanding how those forestry residues on land will decay, we can estimate how much carbon are emitted. We also use the YPCCC first order decay model to estimate the landfill gas. That is how much carbon emissions we've generated if we send some wood waste or even COT product to the landfill. So after we have a good understanding of all the carbon flows that are highly dynamic, we can couple them with our traditional LCA model that include all the emissions and uptake from those manufacturing process throughout the entire life cycle. And this is one of our results that can show you the 100-year GHG emissions for 1 hectare of pine forest land used for COT production. And this is a case study we did for the southern loblolly pine used in the southern United States. So all the positive values at the top represent the emissions, and because we used the Monte Carlo simulation to consider uncertain parameters, so all the results are actually a distribution rather than a single data point. So that's why we have a color shaded area here to represent the ranges of the result. And the largest emission source is COT manufacturing, which also include lumber production, which is not surprising because many manufacturing activities are very energy intensive. They generate a lot of carbon emissions. And all the negative value here represents the carbon sequestration, like this blue dashed line represents the carbon uptake when tree is growing. And at the year of 25, we do the harvesting, but we also do replantation. So that's why across the 100 year, you will see 4 rotation cycles, and the total CO2 sequestrated by standing trees are the summation of these 4 rotation cycles. We also have another green dash line here, represents the carbon stored in the COT product when they are in use. So this is the reason why we always encourage developing wood products that have a really long lifetime. Because the longer lifetime they have, the longer time we can lock in those carbon in those products when they are in use. So by looking at the major product, I have a good understanding of those carbons associated with the trees and also associated with the major product. We also did a similar analysis for all the byproduct. So on the bottom figure, these top 2 lines are represented emissions coming from the wood waste. The first one are those forest residues generated during the harvesting and we just abandon on land, and those are the carbon emissions. The second line represents the emissions coming from the landfill. So if we want to reduce those part of emission because they are significant, they are not negligible, we'd better think of some innovative ways we can use those forest residues rather than just abandon them on land or send them to the landfill. One example is we can sell some of those waste generated by lumber mill to the market so other manufacturers can turn them into some other doable wood products. We use the particle board as an example here, which you can see that, as I mentioned before, when those wood products are in use, they really lock in those carbon there. So the longer time they can keep, that's better, which is very beneficial. So after we have a good understanding of all the carbon flows for the major product and all the byproduct, we can finally put them all together, then result in this super busy figure but it can show you the complexity of all the carbon flows and uptakes across 100 years and also across all the activities involved in the life cycle of a CO2 wood product. So looking at this busy figure, you may wonder, then what is the net carbon implications of this entire system? Well, we can get that insight by summing up all the values together across 100 years, and this is one of our results that show you the net life cycle GHG footprint for 1 hectare of land, and we explored different scenarios. But no matter which scenario we look at, you may notice that all the results are negative, which means they contribute to net carbon removal from the atmosphere, and most of those contribution comes from the carbon uptake by the standing forest and also the carbon stored in those CO2 products when they are in use. So now we can look at those scenarios, like GC1 represent the growth case. So growth case 1 and 2 represent the 2 cases that we have a different forest productivity. And growth 2 is the case where we have higher forest productivity because of better forest management strategies. And our result shows that by increasing forest productivity, we can have more net carbon removal, which is very beneficial. And this highlights the importance of forest management in determining the carbon footprint of wood product. And if we're looking at all the results within the same growth cases, oops. If we look at the result within the same growth cases, we explore 2 scenarios which deal with the ways we treat the wood waste. If we just burn them to recover some energy versus we sell them to the market so other wood product manufacturing can use them and turn them into other durable wood product. And our result shows that it seems like turn them into wood product is more carbon beneficial. And if we go deeper into very specific scenario like scenario 1 and 2, this is a case we explore 2 different end-of-life management strategy for COT product. Like scenario 1 is the case that when COT reach their end of life, we just dump them to the landfill and they will decay there. Where on the scenario 2 is the case that we do some recycling. So our result shows that recycling seems beneficial, but the differences between these 2 blocks chart seems not very large. And we think this is small differences because COT has a very long lifetime. So when we approach the end of 100 years, they actually not so much COT have reached their end of life yet. So if we expand our timeline or shorten our assumption of the COT lifetime, we should be able to see more remarkable differences between just sending to the landfill and doing the recycling. So through this case study, I want to show you the importance of managing not only the manufacturing activity, but also manage forest at the same time, and also the importance of doing a proper waste management for both the major product and for the byproduct generated across the life cycle of a wood product. So in this case study, because we are using the wood coming from a plantation land that have been supplying wood for a long time, so there's no any land use change at all. But for some products that have land use change, their carbon implication may be very different. So this is a review paper published 2 years ago where they tried to review all the good LCA studies published about biofuels. And this is their summary results that can show you the life cycle carbon intensity of biofuel without land use change. So the y-axis is the gram CO2 equivalent per megajoule of fuel based on their energy content. And they used a box plot to show you the variations of different values reported by paper. They summarize the result for bioethanol made from different biomass and also biodiesel made from different biomass. They also put a very important red line here, which is the fossil fuel baseline. So almost all the biofuel pathways they summarized here have lower carbon intensity, although we have some outliers here, but the majority of those biofuel pathways seems like have lower carbon intensity across the life cycle compared to the fossil fuel. And remember, this is the case we don't consider land use change. However, if we include the land use change, almost all the carbon intensity have been raised. And there are some biofuel pathways even have a much higher life cycle carbon intensity than the fossil fuel, which means across the life cycle they contributed to more greenhouse gas emissions in the biofuel. And clearly, this is not what we want, right? So I think now the importance of including land use change when we do the carbon footprint accounting or when we do LCA has already been widely recognized. We all know that the land use change is very important. We need to include their carbon emissions. The challenge is how to develop an LCA model combined with land use change model that can provide reliable estimations and also can be verified in different policy settings. And there's no consensus on which method or which model is the best. So facing these challenges, you may ask me questions like say, it's very challenging, so what is those rule of thumb we can follow if we really want to develop a climate beneficial bioeconomy? The first thing I want to say is that we can always try to use those waste biomass, like forest residues or agricultural residues, because they are waste. They currently don't have valuable uses. So using those waste are very unlikely to drive very big land use changes. Another thing is that not all land use change are bad, like reforestation, off-forestation, as Yong mentioned, those are good, right? Because they increase the carbon stock on land. And this is a study where they try to identify those marginal land in the Middle West United States and try to grow the biomass there for biofuel. And they define those marginal land as those land that are not suitable to grow food crops because of many reasons, like climate constraints or they have really problematic soil. And they also estimate the net life cycle greenhouse gas emission balances for different biomass systems. And this is their total result. You can see that most of them are negative, which means they contribute to a net carbon removal from the atmosphere. And for most of those benefits, they come from this blue color, which is increased soil carbon, although some of them also largely come from this navy color, which comes from the avoid emissions from fossil fuel. Because in this paper, the authors assume that the biofuels made from biomass growing on those marginal land can replace some fossil fuel in the market, and therefore they can avoid those fossil fuel emissions. So by using the case study, I want to say that if we can leverage some bio-based products, because those products can bring revenue, if we can leverage those products to promote more plantation on those land that don't have much vegetation cover, we can have win-win solutions to combat climate change. So that's pretty much the end of my presentation. I just have 4 major takeaway messages I want to highlight. First one is, bioeconomy can really support the replacement of fossil fuel, but the climate implications need to be carefully assessed. And we need to use a systems analysis tool like life cycle assessment to have a holistic view of all the carbon flux across different systems. The third one is ecosystems are highly dynamic. A lot of carbon flows are changing with the time, and we need to consider those dynamics when we do carbon footprint accounting or LCA. The last one, which is, I think is the most important, if we want to develop a climate beneficial bioeconomy, we need to design it in a way hand in hand with land management. Otherwise, those carbon emissions from land use change or poorly managed land may easily offset some carbon benefit we think can achieve by developing different biomass utilization pathways. That's the end of my presentation. Am I on time? I think so. Thank you.
It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you back to the afternoon session of Yale Climate Day, and to kick off with my colleague David Vasseur from the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. David Vasseur. Dave has been at Yale. He's also a career Yale guy. It's a day full of career Yale people. He's been at Yale since 2008, where he started as an assistant professor. He's now a full professor in the EB department. He did both a Bachelor of Science and a Master's of Science at the University of Guelph in Canada, first in biology, then in theoretical ecology, which I didn't actually know that there were any programs that offered theoretical ecology degrees, so that's pretty cool. And then he did his PhD at McGill University, and also in theoretical ecology. He is also the chair of the theoretical ecology section at ESA. Was the chair of the theoretical ecology section of ESA. So I think you have a sense of his specialty, which is He's a theoretical ecologist extraordinaire. So I think he's going to talk to us about some of the relevance of these types of approaches to understanding climate and climate effects on biological systems. So without further ado, Dave. Oh, he's going to talk to us about integrating population dynamics into forecasts of extinction risk. So take it away.
Okay, I'm going to make sure my mic is on here. So thank you for that, Carla. As Carla said, my main interest is in theory and in the theory that we use to guide our understanding of ecological systems. And I started in my work as a PhD student, in fact, getting interested in temperature and thinking about how to integrate temperature into population dynamics and use those population dynamics to address what I think are critical questions. I'm still talking about the same concepts very much today. And so in some ways we've made progress. We've made progress in certain areas, and there are still I would say many deficiencies in what we have the ability to do in terms of forecasting extinction risk. But I want to talk about population dynamics in particular today. Let's make sure that advances. There we go. And specifically, I want to talk about population dynamics and their relevance to extinction risk. And I want to paint the picture of sort of thinking about why we need to use population dynamics, or even the fact that we already do in many cases. So if we think about the IUCN red list and the way we red list species and think about the status of species at risk, it's very much a population dynamic question. This is a slightly older paper from 2008, but it lays out the criteria very nicely. We're essentially looking for species that are showing different types of population dynamic trends. So high decline rates, small ranges in decline, small population size in decline, very small population size, or some other form of quantitative analysis. And typically we're looking for one of these assessments to be satisfied. And so you can see area shows up here in a couple places, small range area or small population size, and that can be related to area as well. But typically, we're talking about needing detailed knowledge of population dynamics to make assessments about a species' risk. This is a paper from 2004, and it's already quite dated. There are a number of updates to this, but I want to use this as an example because they lay out their criteria for categorizing species at risk in a very, very clear way. And if you read through these criteria, all of them essentially rely on forecasts of projections of viable area. So they're not really dealing with population dynamics, right? We're thinking instead, are species at risk because the area in which we know they live is going to become threatened or reduced in size under climate change? And so, when we think about extinction risk, it's a forecasting problem. And so one of the challenges we have if we want to use population dynamics, of course, is that we have to forecast population dynamics. And there are a number of great papers about the idea of forecasting population dynamics. I think this 2015 paper from Owen Petty does one of the best jobs in laying out many of the challenges that we have. But essentially, a good forecast is something that has some sort of level of proficiency some point into the future. And this is sort of a classic way we might think about the value of a forecast declining over time. Unfortunately, when we think about population dynamics, our best forecasters are essentially statistical models. We can think about things like the mean or a moving average or an autoregressive process, all of which are telling us about some sort of short-term trend in the dynamics. Those actually tend to perform better than mechanistic models. So models that we build upon first principles, trying to study the processes of birth, death, migration. Those statistical models still outperform most of our mechanistic models. And so if forecasts of population dynamics are really to be brought into a realm where we want to use them to forecast extinction risk, we must improve them a great deal, right? So if we rely solely upon statistical models, on the other hand, we cannot predict a population decline or an increasing risk until we see it. We're relying very much on existing data to sort of categorize those trends. So that's sort of where I fit in this talk a little bit. And the talk is very much a work in progress. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the forecasting work that exists out there that stems into the work that I am currently sort of pushing toward. I would say I'm not fully I haven't worked out all the kinks yet, so this is very much research in progress. So I'm going to talk about thermal performance and forecasting, so specifically to this idea of temperature and embedding temperature into population dynamics. And then I want to talk a little bit about extinction risk and how that dovetails into some of these questions. And I put up a picture because I had a lot of empty space on this slide, of course. And I wanted to emphasize that this question of temperature dependence in population dynamics is something that I've really been driven by for the last decade, perhaps more. We do a lot of experimental work in my lab, in both in my lab and in the labs of colleagues, and in this case, a previous postdoc. That's Sam Fay in the picture working on an apparatus that we created we call the thermal gradient block. And these are blocks that we heat on one end, cool on the other, and they create a large gradient of temperature that we can then do experiments with things like Chlamydomonas, which is a cosmopolitan algal species. So we've been doing a lot of work trying to understand how we can fundamentally build temperature and temperature variation into population dynamics. I'm not going to talk about the experimental work today. Instead, I want to focus more on the theoretical constructs. And I want to point out what I think is a clearly significant problem in the way we currently forecast risk and give a solution, or at least sort of a potential solution for where we could go and in a sense to solve that problem. So thermal performance curves, just to sort of tread a little bit into the background, are ubiquitous in the literature. They have become one of the predominant ways that we try to describe how temperature influences vital processes in organisms and at the population and community levels as well. So this is a figure from a recent review paper that shows performance curves for here photosynthetic rates, here movement rates, and I think at the bottom here, these are population growth rates. And these are just all thrown from different sources into one figure, and you can see they tend to take this similar shape and form, where you have a slow rise on the left-hand side, reaching some mode, and then a quick tail off on the right-hand side. So we call this a skewed unimodal function. Almost every thermal performance curve that we measure tends to have this kind of shape. And in fact, these curves have become really popular tools for forecasting the risk of warming and climate change. And I'll walk you through how they're typically used. I'm just sort of pulling out 3 studies out of the literature, one of them my own, so I can comment and critique it a little bit. But essentially, the way we have used these thermal performance curves is to overlay environmental characteristics on these curves and think about how often temperature will push species to have potentially detrimental consequences on that performance measurement, okay? So if you think of this example on the left here, this is a contrast between tropical species and high latitude species or temperate species. And the gray dot represents the mean temperature for that particular species in its current habitat. And the bars represent some average of seasonal variation. And so if we were to think about the performance of that particular species, we might say, it actually looks pretty good. There's no reason to believe that this performance would be compromised even after some degree of warming. And so in 2008 and a little bit thereafter, a lot of the discussion was focused on this idea that tropical species were potentially at risk of warming, but temperate species had a lot of room. There was a lot of space where they could tolerate warming and not experience temperatures that perhaps pushed them into these sort of detrimental ranges of performance. And what is detrimental? I think that's another important point here. None of these curves typically go past 0. So here we're looking at what they're calling relative Darwinian fitness. You have to dig into the paper to understand what they really mean here. But if you think about performance in general, there's a lot of measurements where it wouldn't make sense to have anything less than 0. And there are some others where it does make sense to have negative values. And so the question then becomes, well, if we're pushing temperatures to such extreme values that we're surpassing what I'm going to call Tmax, or the critical upper temperature for these species, what happens beyond that? And that's really a problem that we're starting to face more and more as we see the impacts of warming unfolding for many species. And it's the problem that we haven't dealt with very well. So again, this is another figure here that shows these tropical species having potentially greater detrimental impacts of warming in the future. And again, I was involved in a group that restudied the same data set that was used in the Curtis Deutsch paper in 2008 under a different set of assumptions. I'm going to unpack those assumptions in just a minute, but we found a completely different answer. And we got a completely different answer for a couple reasons. One is that we included more temperature variation at finer scales, both temporally and spatially. So there was greater potential to have those short moments of very high impact events. The second thing we did was we imagined that performance could go negative. And I'm going to circle back on that for just a minute. But most of the papers sort of prior to this said performance is always grounded. It's always bounded, to be above 0, including 0 or above. So as a sort of complement to this approach of estimating performance based upon this overlay of climate data onto these performance curves, another concept that's become really popular is this idea of a thermal safety margin, or the question essentially being how much space between that critical upper maximum temperature for a species and the environmental maximum is there. And this is just a recent meta-analysis done in 2019 for a bunch of different groups here that are living in coastal ecosystems, aquatic ecosystems, and then you've got tide pool groups, and then they've done some forecasting for the year 2100. And anything that's up in the blue has a positive thermal safety margin, meaning that there is space between that upper critical maximum temperature and the current maximum temperature in the ambient environment. Anything that's below that line, that 0 threshold, is already experiencing conditions that exceed its critical upper limit. What does that mean? Obviously, these are species that exist, so they can tolerate some degree of temperature surpassing that critical level. What we really don't know, and what we need a population dynamic approach to tell us, is how risky are those environments for those species. And I think that's a bit of an open question in general for the field, and that's one where I'm really trying to focus my time. This is another study here by Jennifer Sunday, showing some similar data, this time for insects, amphibians, reptiles. And there's a comparison here between the CT max, so that's again that upper maximum thermal threshold for growth or performance in general, and anything into these yellow segments of the box are species that are experiencing dangerous conditions. Now, of course, terrestrial animals can move. They can behaviorally thermoregulate. They can avoid those stressful conditions if there's enough microhabitat variation. And that's something that I'm very interested in, that we've been studying from a theoretical perspective in my lab. But of course, aquatic systems have a much greater challenge. Those systems are far more homogenized, and avoiding those critical conditions can be very difficult for organisms. So in many senses, these ectotherms have to deal with these environmental conditions. These ones have some latitude in terms of their ability to avoid those conditions, but both of those, of course, have costs. Now, getting to the sort of backbone of what I really want to talk about, which is including population dynamics into these kinds of questions. The skewed unimodal shape of a thermal performance curve is assumed to arise when you take the difference between two processes and two nonlinear processes. And I'm going to give you an example here. If birth is just a symmetric or any type of unimodal function of temperature, and we have a process like death or some other loss process that increases exponentially or according to something like a Boltzmann-Arrhenius relationship, then the difference between those two, the positive and the negative components, will give us a skewed unimodal function. There have been a bunch of different papers that have collected data and tried to validate this idea that birth being this shape combined with death represented as a function like this will give us, in fact, we know they will give us this skewed unimodal function. Of course, the question is always, are these the right assumptions? And there are, in fact, a bunch of other assumptions one can make when thinking about birth and death or any processes of gain and loss, so ingestion versus respiration. All of that sort of thinking about the critical biomass building in a population as an element of its performance. So I'm going to focus on birth and death. But I want to come back to this question about negatives. So this was a paper published by Arthur Woods in 2018. And Art Woods looked at some different ideas and compared some different approaches to using these thermal performance curves to estimate performance under different conditions. And one of the ones that I'm sort of focusing on here is this idea that there's a curve with a negative and another curve without. And we can contrast the effect that including those negative values has. And it wasn't a great deal, but there are some spots where you can see in the data, and this is data for performance of the Manduka caterpillar. So this is one of Joel Kingsolver's favorite organisms, and he was an author on this paper, as was I, in fact. And we looked pretty deeply into different data and thought critically about this issue of negative values. We didn't get to a deep answer at that point. But I started to understand a little bit more deeply the consequence of including negative values into these estimates. And although we get a little bit better forecast of dynamics, perhaps, we're still not getting population dynamics, and we're not getting to the heart of the problem. So here is the real crux of the issue that I want to present. If we take a thermal performance curve and we imagine that we have an environment that is seasonal, and I'm just going to pick and choose some values here. This seems a little hot. Don't worry about it. This is just all sort of calibrating on the curve, right? I'm going to choose a seasonal signal here, in this case, of a 36-degree mean, about 4¼ degrees of amplitude. And you can see that that gives me a range of temperatures that are going to cross just slightly into negative performance. And so if I looked at the performance of my model organism here, in most cases it's pretty high, and rarely it drops below 0. But on average, I get a value of about 0.67. My maximum value is 1, so that seems fantastic, right? Nothing to worry about. Of course, if we actually model population dynamics based upon this signal of the environment, the moments when this system is passing through low values or negative values of performance, at that point, death is exceeding birth. Death is happening faster than birth, and we do have the possibility of extinction. So there's a real key issue here when we go from performance-based aggregate or average measurements to these population dynamic measurements. We can actually skip past or forecast past extinction events without understanding how important they in fact might be. So how do we actually connect thermal performance curves to these population dynamic-based assessments? Well, my thoughts on this matter are really that we need to turn to a stochastic process model. I'm not going to go into the details of that model. But essentially, if we're thinking about temperature and its effect on, I'm going to call this Malthusian fitness now, like little r, the intrinsic rate of growth, right? This is birth minus death in my sort of philosophy. Then we know extinction will always happen, of course. Stochastic models always produce extinction. It just may take a very, very long time. But if we're in the range of temperatures where we have a negative growth rate, we're on a trajectory of deterministic extinction. And so in these cases, we actually have models that can help us infer what's really happening. So by defining a birth process and a death process in the ways that I have already defined them as being functions of temperature, we can use a continuous time Markov process that actually allows us to calculate, or at least estimate analytically, the time to extinction a population would face under a certain temperature and under a certain fluctuating temperature regime. We need to know at least two of the following if we're going to sort of apply this model to a real system. And that's that we need to know the temperature dependence of birth or growth, temperature dependence of death or loss, however we're defining those things, or the population growth rate, because of course the population growth rate is the difference of those two things. If we have two of those three, we can infer the last one that we might need. And of course we might include some ideas about density dependence, and I'm not going to go into detail about that part today. Unfortunately, I don't have time. This is an example that didn't come out of my lab, but some data I really loved. You would think, if I step back, that satisfying two of these three seems easy. It's in fact an extremely tall order. We know very little about the temperature effects on these vital rates of birth and death for most organisms. And this is a system here. This is Phaeodactylum. This is a diatom. And they have measured, in fact, in these different assays, we have the population growth rate in the blue curve, and we have the death rate in the red curve. And you can see for most of these different samples here, what we're seeing is very little death, very little effective temperature on death until we reach the higher extreme values, and then death starts to ramp up really quickly. So I'm just going to go through an example of a model not fitted to that data, but tailored to it, essentially representing some of the elements of that data set. So we have a basic birth function, death function. If we were to write those down in an ordinary differential equation form, it's essentially exponential growth governed by temperature. We can add a bit of density dependence into that system to turn it into logistic growth. It makes it behave a little bit better and gives us the ability to then analytically estimate time to extinction for populations that are governed by those birth and death processes. And here's what that looks like. So the upper figure here is just showing B minus D, so that's my thermal performance curve. I've also plotted the ratio of those two things. I'm not going to go into detail about why that's important, but it enters in pretty heavily into the calculation of extinction time. This curve here on the blue curve is actually segmented into two parts. It is the time to extinction that one would estimate given the inputs for birth and death that are slightly kind of fitted to that diatom system. One thing I want you to notice is the scale of this graph, right? Here at about 26, 27 degrees, that population exists essentially as long as, 4.5 billion years I put on there, right? Essentially the age of the Earth, right? Very low extinction risk. But that risk rises rapidly as we approach the Tmax value. And it rises so rapidly that we end up down here in the range of decades to years to weeks. And then as we cross that threshold, there's a break in my curve because my mathematical prowess is weak and I'm struggling to work out the derivation in the neighborhood of Tmax. I can get it on either side. I haven't solved it for the middle yet. But over here, this is essentially just a game of waiting until the population goes extinct. We know it will, and it will happen very quickly. So the nice thing about having this picture, this sort of image of how temperature affects extinction rates, is then we can use these models to predict extinction risk given different types of environments. So I'll go through one quick example. I know I'm going to run short on time. I've also included some sort of snapshots of what the population dynamics under these different scenarios look like. And you can see very, very significant difference. These are just 20 different trajectories overlaid. This is a small population of very low abundance as it approaches the extinction threshold, but it's still robust against extinction, given that we haven't included anything like inbreeding depression, a lot of other sources of uncertainty that enter into small population dynamics. As you get near that threshold, you end up with populations going extinct, and in the deterministic range, they all go extinct very quickly. We can also look at how seasonal variation influences the risk, and we can do that analytically. We can also do it with simulations. These are some results of simulations that I'm showing here. And what I want you to focus in on is this green curve, and I apologize, I've switched up the color scheme, but this gives us the probability of extinction after 1 decade of growing in a certain temperature. And so you can see about half of the populations, or we would expect a population to persist about half the time at 28 degrees, and that's considering that it's Tmax, the maximum value we would expect it to persist at under perfect conditions, is about a half degree above that. So those extinctions happen because of demographic stochasticity, just the randomness of births and deaths in the model. As you add in some seasonality, you add 1 degree, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, you push that threshold back. So the mean temperature now needs to be lower and lower to provide that thermal safety margin for species. And what's interesting about this is when you analyze it, it's a near perfect 1-to-1, or what I'll call a negative 1-to-1 relationship between the mean and amplitude of the temperature variation that these populations will tolerate. And the reason for that, well, you can sort of think, I'll skip ahead to my next slide and come back, is that what really matters is what's happening in the warm end of these temperatures. So here is the warmest tolerable mean temperature as a function of amplitude. And so as the amplitude of these variations gets bigger, I draw a bigger line there, and you can see these all tend to line up in such a way that their right-hand endpoints are very much about the same part of the temperature range. And what that tells us is it's those few rare moments that individuals experience at the warmest temperatures that almost entirely governs extinction risk for these populations. And that's important because that is a very separate concept from the way we have typically been using these thermal performance curves to assess extinction or predict extinction risk. Based upon the average thermal performance, we might see a picture something like this, right? Where that curvature of the line as we add more amplitude of variation in is coming entirely from a nonlinear averaging process. It's essentially a Jensen's inequality problem, if you're familiar with that concept. When we do this based upon population dynamics, we get this sort of -1 relationship. And that is reflective of the fact that it's those rare hot events that are driving population extinctions. Okay, so if we step back and I show this slide again that talks about thermal safety margins, my point is just that we can actually start to unpack what an appropriate thermal safety margin would be for a particular species. We need to know certain things about the underlying processes driving those populations, but it gives us some information that we can use to guide this work. There's another problem that I'll just touch upon, And of course, it's that we often measure these upper critical values in very different ways. So as a population dynamicist, I think of those as the area or the point in temperature spectrum where birth and death are happening at the same rates. A physiologist may measure these upper maxima as the point at which an organism stops being able to perform a particular task or function. And those two things may not line up very well. And that's a problem we have to overcome. In fact, I'm trying to tackle some of that research right now in my lab. We're using protists where we do have overlap in our ability to both do behavioral assays and physiological assays, and at the same time create these population growth curves. So we're going to use protists as a means of trying to interface some of these different issues. I'll just make one last point that this is, as I said, a work in progress, but one of the values of this approach is we can then start to look at different variations in life history and think about how this affects our extinction curves. These temperature extinction curves are highly conserved across a wide variety of different assumptions. So here's just an example of presenting resource scarcity or adding some resource scarcity to the problem. We actually see a shift in that curve, but nothing fundamentally changes about the shape of that curve. If we do something like modify the turnover rate, so we move from a very fast-paced organism like algae to something that has a much, much slower rate of death and birth, we can see how that affects the shapes of these curves. And so by making adjustments to the model, we'll get a better sense of how these thermal safety margins need to reflect variations in life history. So this is, sort of, I think, something that I'm going to continue to tackle over the next year. We'll see where I get with it, but at this point, it's proved to be, I think, an illuminating project. There's a bunch of folks I have to thank, and I've not included any of my current graduate students in there just yet, but I need to thank them as well on this list. So a number of people in my group have worked on various questions around temperature over the years, and all of them have been, I think, very influential to the way that I've been thinking about this problem and the way that I currently approach it. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
I guess we probably have time for like a question while we switch over.
Sorry, I'm
Joe,
long.
if you wanna come get set up.
I have a question.
I saw a hand.
Whoa, it's really loud.
Noah, yeah.
Great talk. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
I love the idea of introducing a stochastic approach to it, thinking about temperature extremes. But instead of seasonality, I think the thing that should actually make most of the difference from this framework is actually, of course, thinking about things on the marine side, like marine heat waves or temperature spikes on kind of a decadal scale. Have you thought about how to take kind of the variability from CMIP6 projections and put it into kind of your framework or how do you deal with, to put it even in a more simple context, how do you deal with huge estimates in model outputs for the next 100 years on temperature extremes?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a big question, sort of, if I can take your question. Seasonality in the cosine wave is the sort of simplest form of variability you can put into these models and just get a sense of, what kind of patterns you could see. There are easy ways to deal with other types of uncertainty and environmental variation. So these models are really amenable to using something like an OU process, essentially, to look at fluctuations that have autocorrelation, so you can layer them on top of the temperature signal. There's some really cool innovations that people have worked out over the past few years that help you to solve the necessary parts of the model to allow you to integrate in a variable environment. And so that's definitely a next step that I'm going to take on top of this. Really, ultimately, what the models are telling us is that it's these forays into difficult conditions that are really driving extinction. And so boiling down the math to tell us whether there's some type of an integral we can solve for that range, sort of give us a sense of, the maximum duration of exposure that these populations will tolerate, given all of our parameters in the model. I think that will give us some way to sort of say something informative. I don't know if I answered your question exactly. We can talk more. Thanks.
Love to.